I want to tell you, though, that I've updated the subtitle of my presentation. I will get around to the invention of necessity, but a research journey is a much more descriptive subtitle for what I'm going to share with you today. I'll warn you that I'm going to show you a lot of pictures of white textiles, and when I edited them using digital software to enhance the design so you can see more. But along the way, some of the colors sort of changed in odd ways, so ignore any variation in color. The colors of the white pieces, the colors that you may perceive, are meaningless. Okay. I discovered quilts as a graduate student in folklore in 1975. At that point, I read all the books on quilt history that were then available. It was possible then to do it. And that was back when the authors, from Marie Webster on down, told us that the earliest American quilts were utilitarian crazy quilts. I was aware from the beginning of the presence of early white whole cloth bed covers, but I found myself more attracted to the colors and patterns of patchwork. But as a nascent folklorist, I wanted to know about real quilts made and used by ordinary people, and these embellished white bed covers seemed like something else entirely. Besides, not all of them were actually quilts. Some of them were merely embroidered, and others were, unfortunately, candlewick bedspreads. Now, I didn't know anything about these techniques, but I knew I wasn't interested in them. And as it turned out, nobody else has been much interested in early white American bed covers for most of the past 35 years. There are exceptions, but if you look for information, if you look for real information, it's very hard to find. Now, by the 1980s, a lot of us had figured out that the crazy quilt origin idea had no factual basis. Sally Garoot published her pioneer article on Marseille quilts and woven spreads in Uncoverings 1982. And this introduced those of us who were paying attention at the time to the idea of a European tradition. So I was at that point among the curators and authors who would introduce our historical exhibitions and publications with a white embellished whole cloth quilt and a citation of Sally's article. And then we would move on to the more colorful and more photogenic patchwork. During the 1980s, Dorothy Osler and Janet Ray showed us evidence of well-established whole cloth quilting traditions in the British Isles, and they were elaborating on the work of Avril Colby. In 1995, Catherine Berenson contributed an illuminating article on Marseille needlework in Uncoverings 1995, and her book, Quilts of Provence, appeared the following year. And her new work, continues, as we saw yesterday, to demonstrate the variety and virtuosity of whole cloth quilts as a vibrant tradition, a successful industry, and a key element in international trade. In 2006, I decided to take a closer look at early American white bed covers, all of them, including embroidered and candlewick spreads. I was astounded to realize how little we knew about them. I wanted to understand what these white bed covers meant to the women who made them, their families, and their communities. I didn't know where to start, so I applied for fellowships and grants. And initially I spent a week at MESDA, that's the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a wonderful place to go. So I spent a week there in April 2006, 5 years ago. Starting with the assumption that American examples must have been a continuation of these European traditions, I looked to ethnic ancestry, family history, techniques, and textiles for clues to some sort of transatlantic connection. Now, these early efforts didn't really lead anywhere, but I published my negative findings in 2 preliminary articles in which I essentially called for more research on this important body of women's textile history. I decided, since this didn't go anywhere, I needed to see more white bed covers, to observe what I could learn by simply looking. What can I see in these pieces? I thought it would be a good idea, while I was looking at these pieces, to have a data collection form to record details of the pieces I examined. Now, the forms that we used for our quilt survey projects all over, they are very nice for collecting information on fabrics and patterns, but they don't work very well. There are a lot of blanks in the form and no place to put the real stuff when you're working with these embellished white bed covers. So I enlisted the help of Maren Hansen to help me design a form for collecting data from whole cloth quilts and embroidered and candlewick counterpanes. My attempts to include all the possible variables resulted in a form of unworkable length and complexity. And Maren wisely suggested that we just outline the basics and allow for descriptive comments. Now, this form, actually, we do have a form. It might be useful to other researchers someday, but even this experience told me that this wasn't the direction for my own research. I wasn't going to do statistical analysis. I'm just not natured up that way, as they say. I didn't want to spend more time looking at the form than the bed covers. So I examined white quilts and counterpanes in museums and private collections in North and South Carolina. Start close to home, right? So you can see this is the opposite side. This is the opposite side of that. So you can see the front and back of two details. I had thought that these textiles were relatively rare, but I seemed to find them everywhere once I started asking, do you have any old white bed covers? And not only did I find them everywhere, but they displayed a rather astonishing variety of embellishment techniques, design elements, and skill levels. Few of them, however, resembled what I had been learning about European traditions. Furthermore, they seemed to have proliferated in the early 19th century, often made by women whose families had lived in America for many generations. So I abandoned my search for direct European connections, and I decided to broaden my exploration into published sources and archival collections to find out what was going on at the time that American women were making these pieces in large numbers. So in February 2008, wrong one, I arrived at Winterthur for a month-long fellowship. I wanted to look at white bed covers, but also, more importantly, to explore their extensive library to learn more about the historical, social, and cultural contexts that surrounded the women who made these pieces. So, these are books in my collection, but these are the kinds of books I was looking at. I also discovered the work of Beverly Lemire for the first time. Her books on costume and consumerism and cotton were wonderful. I immediately did what I always do. When I find a book that's interesting to me, I go online and see if I can buy a used copy. The out-of-print copies of Beverly's books are sky high. So I'm looking forward to her forthcoming book. So I have copious photocopies of pages from her books. What's that? That's the wrong one. Okay, wait. While I was at Winterthur, I identified a number of dead-end directions. But I gradually found copious published material on the impact of the Revolutionary War on emerging American society. The books I found, most of them, none of these mentioned white bed covers at all. In fact, some of them didn't even mention textiles. Some of them didn't even mention women, for that matter. So I spent the next 2 years reading and assimilating the material I had collected. I juggled ideas, including but not limited to gentility, whiteness, fashion and consumerism, revolutionary politics, Republican womanhood, textile technology, imports and non-importation, American myths and realities. I thought that if I could just juxtapose all of these elements in just the right configuration, they would all fit together to form the context for my work on white bed covers. So I found myself looking for the key that would complete the puzzle. I began to formulate a theory that these white bed covers were rooted in the in women's experience in the Revolutionary War period. Briefly, the Stamp Act in 1765 incited American colonists to boycott British imports. Since the colonies were heavily dependent on British imports, a lot like us trying to avoid Chinese imports today, the boycott focused on only two items, tea, which was made famous by the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and textiles. Both boycotts had an impact on the daily lives of women. So boycott leaders weren't stupid. They encouraged the involvement of women, describing them as equal partners in the fight for freedom from oppression. In northern colonies, women, particularly young women, held public spinning bees to demonstrate their willingness to practice this quintessentially humble female craft in service to liberty. Typically a group of 20 to 40 women dressed in homespun garments and perhaps calling themselves the Daughters of Liberty would gather at the home of a local minister or some other public place to spend the day at their wheels while engaging in enlightening conversation. And local people would troop through to observe this happening. So these were largely symbolic, as they weren't going to be making enough textiles to clothe even their families, let alone all the American colonies. But they attracted much favorable comment. The industry and frugality of American ladies must exalt their character in the eyes of the world and serve to show how greatly they are contributing to bring about the political salvation of a whole continent. That's an example of the rhetoric that was honoring women at this point. Now, in the southern colonies, the public response to the patriotic fervor, and in particular to non-importation and home production of textiles, was more complicated. The southern economy depended on the exchange of agricultural products, rice, indigo, tobacco, and later cotton, for finished goods coming through Britain. Before 1765, spinning and weaving were largely confined to the backcountry South, because people were in Charleston and other cities were buying their stuff from their cousins in London. So the call for home manufacturers had a profound impact, particularly on southern plantations, which had long been heavily dependent on imported cloth to clothe their slaves. Planters initially resisted the idea of reassigning female slaves from field work to spinning and weaving. But by 1779, a visitor Virginia noted that spinning was, quote, the chief employment of the female Negroes, unquote. Public spinning bees were largely absent, or at least less public in the southern colonies, although the wearing of homespun seems to have been practiced publicly in some cases. But patriot women, even genteel women, took up spinning and knitting in their homes. For example, a Virginia woman, Betsy Ambler Brent, later recalled, quote, the plan laid down for our education was entirely broken in upon by the war. Instead of morning lessons, we were to knit stockings. Instead of embroidering, to make up homespun garments, unquote. The Revolution transformed the South from a region depending almost wholly on the outside world for manufactured commodities to one in which many of the commodities were made by the people in their homes or on their plantations, so says Rolla Tryon in his remarkable survey of household manufacturers. After the war, home textile production continued on a large scale in many places, particularly in the backcountry and in rural areas. However, this increase in domestic textile production did not reduce dependence on British textile imports, which actually increased during the 1790s. Increased greatly once the war was over. These two facts together, the continuation of home production of textiles and the increase in British textiles, suggest to me that once the hostilities had been resolved, the former colonists once again satisfied their desires to be comfortable, fashionable, and genteel. So I knew from Sally Garut's and from Catherine Berenson's work that those imported textiles that were a part of that great increase, both before and after the Revolution, included bed covers. Both the early handmade Marseille quilts in the center and left, and the machine-made factory woven versions that were quilted in the loom here in the right-hand corner. So both of these things were among those bundles and bales of textiles coming into Charleston and diffusing throughout the South. And I work on this, I focus on the South because that's where I live. Things may be different or may be similar in other parts of the country. So I theorize that although these imports remained popular throughout the period, something remained of the revolutionary virtues of self-reliance, frugality, and republican virtue, and that some women continued to make their own white bed covers as an embodiment of those values. Now, here's the confession time. I became distracted for a time by the further notion that women who saw their hopes for full equality dashed after the Revolution during the New Republic, that they might have consoled themselves through the reenactment of textile production as revolutionary virtue. I found myself looking for the smoking needle. That would be the diary entry or sisterly letter that would reveal the patriotic or commemorative impulse behind the creation of a white quilt or counterpane. I searched and downloaded online finding aids to manuscript collections in the Southern Historical Collection at UNC Chapel Hill. It's a very large manuscript collection, in anticipation of a multi-day research trip to this particular haystack. Thankfully, I realized that finding a single smoking needle would be inconclusive and of little use, not to mention incendiary. And I abandoned this direction. During this time, though, when people asked me how my work was going, I reported that it was all very complicated and very interesting, but that it would take me several more years to get it figured out. In other words, I was stuck, though I didn't realize it. As I see it now, my problem was that I thought I was close to finding an answer. This may not sound like a bad thing, but I'm convinced that the search for answers, although a natural human tendency, actually inhibits the development of further understanding. If I'm looking for an answer, I'll probably find one. And once I say, this is it, I stop looking for other possible answers. The challenge of research, as I see it, is to keep asking open-ended questions long enough to recognize that reality is a complex organism and a thorough understanding is rarely possible. My goal then becomes to continue to ask, refine, and explore the questions indefinitely, which is very difficult and uncomfortable. I'm not alone in having experienced premature elucidation when engaged with a seductive theory. To see this tendency in others is always easier than to recognize it in oneself. For example, In 2007, the American Folk Art Museum presented an exhibition called White on White and a Little Gray, featuring 10 white whole cloth bed covers and some other objects which I didn't look at from their collection. In promotional and interpretive material for this exhibition, the curator attributed these pieces to a neoclassical impulse, which she defined as an ideal that could be captured only in the incorruptibility of whites that directly invoked the transcendence, purity, and timelessness of classical antiquity. The whiteness of white was the perfect metaphor for the age of enlightenment. Brilliant whiteness invited an intellectual engagement with the physical world it illuminated. Blinding yet revealing, it exposed all flaws and demanded perfection. When I visited the museum and gazed upon the embellished stuffed work, quilting, embroidery, and, yes, candlewick spreads, cleaned to perfection and displayed without a wrinkle. When I saw these, neoclassicism certainly seemed like a plausible influence. But then I thought of other white bed covers I had examined, made by women in southern backcountry settlements, often exuberant, but unsophisticated in design and unabashedly imperfect in execution. These pieces suggested little connection with transcendence and other high-toned urban notions, and neoclassicism seemed, at best, an incomplete explanation. While I certainly empathized with a curator who needed an interpretive framework in which to exhibit these elegant bed covers, I felt strongly that there was much more to learn. However, any smugness I may have felt about this particular interpretive strategy evaporated with the recognition that I had embraced a similar answer, and that my perceived need to formulate a coherent statement explaining the meaning of early white bed covers as relics of women's dashed hopes after the Revolution had brought my actual research to a standstill. When I finally sat down and tried to write out a simple explanation of my theory, the resulting statement sounded contrived and utterly unconvincing. Neither neoclassicism nor revolutionary nostalgia is the answer to why women made white bed covers, but certainly both are threads within a web of intertwining influences. Having abandoned my search for the elusive and theoretical key to all American white bed covers, I have returned to square one, the bed covers themselves. This time, however, instead of looking just at the physical characteristics, I wanted to know about the women who made them. A surprising number of surviving white bed covers are either inscribed with names and dates, or they're uninscribed but attributed to a particular woman by oral tradition and or handwritten family documents. These are real quilts and counterpanes. See, it says, whoops, sorry. Her counterpane. These are real quilts and counterpanes made by ordinary women. The names of the women and their families appear in public records and published local histories, just waiting to be consulted. These quilts and counterpanes are both documents of the lives of early American women and artifacts of some of their earliest artistic expressions. Collectively and individually, these pieces are among the most unexplored, unappreciated, and underutilized objects languishing in museum storage and family cedar chests. Some museums, of course, already recognize the value and significance of these early textiles. The Dar Museum Collection includes a number of inscribed or attributed white bed covers supported by a fine collection of genealogical documentation. One of those pieces is a counterpane displayed here in a backlighted display case in which the embroidered areas appear as black silhouettes. The donor identified the maker as her grandmother, Mary Elizabeth Graham, later the wife of Ezekiel Price of York County, South Carolina. Mary Elizabeth was about 15 years old when she made her counterpane, which documents a trip with her father to Columbia, the state capital. While there, she saw the newly built State House, which was then a wooden structure with a brick basement, and she decided to depict this building in her embroidery. The information provided by the maker's granddaughter also includes the following statement. She picked the cotton, picked the lint off the seed by hand, and spun it into yarn. This yarn was then used for the chain and filling. Now, many of us have heard similar narratives so often that we regard them with skepticism, to say the least. In fact, when the DAR exhibited this piece, they didn't mention the home production narrative. Instead, they decided to question whether or not the embroidered building actually resembled the State House. They consulted authorities on South Carolina historical architecture and wondered if this, she maybe made a mistake. Well, who cares? It's her design. She can do whatever she wants. However, the specificity of the attribution of this as the work of her hands, that she picked out the seeds and spun the cotton. And remember, she's in the area near Charlotte. This is right across the border from Charlotte. This is the South. This is cotton growing area. Who's growing the cotton? Who's usually picking it out? So this is humility. This cover is elegant and humble at the same time. But the frequency of similar home production narratives, especially the ones attached to Southern embroidered counterpanes, suggests our need to revisit our skepticism about these narratives. This piece also includes sunflowers and other details done in Dresden work. Dresden work is an embroidery technique also called drawn or cut work, and there's examples in the exhibition, which is very nice, which is also invites all sorts of questions. I want to return to the subjects of home production and Dresden work later on, but first I want to share a personal experience anecdote of an event that furthered and expanded and changed my research directions. On a trip to North Carolina in 2008, my initial foray into looking at white bed covers outside my local area, I visited Dan Patterson, my now retired thesis advisor, and his wife Beverly. Those of you who wondered why I dedicated my book to someone you'd never heard of, this is Dan Patterson. Over dinner, I told them about my research, and Dan asked, "Are you interested in woven bed covers?" I told them I wasn't familiar with woven examples, but I was willing to look at anything that might be related to whatever it was that I was studying. He brought out an ancestral counterpane made by Lydia Ann Stamps, later the wife of Spears Walters, born in 1783 in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, right along the North Carolina border. She likely wove this piece before her marriage in 1812. My first impression was that this piece looked like candlewick, but I saw that the little tufts were created by pulling loops of a heavier yarn that was woven. It was inserted into the weft at regular intervals. So she's weaving along, little light, small threads. Then every once in a while, if she's counting, I guess, she inserts this heavier yarn. But instead of, beating that down, she wraps that yarn around a stick. She lays a stick across the shed and is doing this by hand, like a tapestry technique. And she brings it up between the threads and wraps it around the stick and then goes back down. So she's doing this as she goes along, one row at a time. I know this is sideways, but you can sort of see. Now, to embroider a floral design like this, one would lay out a thing and just embroider your stem toward where your flower is going to be. And then you add the leaves and blossoms and choose to stop when the design looks right. For a woven piece, however, you need to you're going to start at one end and build the design up. So I don't know very much about how she would have done this, but she would have started with a paper draft or a drawing or a schematic of the whole design, and then she would have recreated that on her loom in 2 panels, pulling the loops at the proper sequence to make those curves. This piece opened my eyes to an important body of woven embellished bed covers. So thanks to my weaver friends, I now have a rudimentary understanding of the process of weft loop weaving, which involves manually wrapping the heavy yarn, as I described, around a stick or a rod to create the loops in the appropriate places. A similar technique is called a boutonnet by Acadians in Nova Scotia and Louisiana. And even more elaborate hand-woven, these are hand-woven textiles called caddos, I spelled it up there, caddos, were produced in Lancashire, England. The earliest known surviving caddos are 2 pieces in the collection of the Bolton Museum. These aren't them. These are ones that show up better on the screen. But the earliest 2 are dated 1794 and 1795. The majority of the pieces in their collection, or at least the ones on their website, boltonmuseum.org or something like that, the majority of the ones they have date from the mid-19th century. These are hand-woven commemorative pieces that they're being made late 18th and early 19th century. But by this time, factories in Bolton were producing large numbers of machine-woven, factory-woven cotton bed covers embellished with patterns of loops similar to these. These Boltons were among the textiles exported to the new United States. So to me, I know so little about these. I've just told you everything I know about these pieces. These Boltons were among the textiles exported to the new United States, raising many interesting questions about the chronology and migration and possible influences, not only on American home-woven weft loop counterpanes, but on the particular style of looped and tufted embroidery that we call candlewick. To complicate matters, the Dar Museum owns a counterpane that was woven with that periodic insertion of a heavier weft yarn, but the pattern of loops was not pulled from the weft, wasn't wrapped around the stick, but someone embroidered them later on the finished woven piece. They embroider with a heavy candlewick yarn. It gets very complicated. At some point, I realized that the Lydia Stamps counterpane was not the first example of a weft loop white bed cover I had ever seen. The previous year, following the death of my mother, I had inherited a family textile made by my great-great-great-grandmother. At the time I brought home this rather plain woven piece, I remember thinking, it's too bad this is woven, otherwise it would be a part of my research. I hope you can see this. The counterpane was made by Elizabeth O'Neill, later the wife of Uriah Mackay. She was born in 1786 near Bardstown, Nelson County, in the Kentucky Territory of Western Virginia. In 1889, at the age of 103, Elizabeth gave the counterpane to a grandson, Walter Mackay. From there, the trajectory of the counterpane crisscrosses the family tree among childless first cousins and their removes before it came to my mother and to me. Okay, so she, at the age of 103, she gave it to her grandson, Walter. Now, I show you Uriah, Ludwell, and Charles, her sons. Those are the youngest of her, 3 of her 9 children. So this only deals with these things. Okay, so she gave it to Walter in 1889. He had it for about 40 years. I think in 1939, he gave it to his sister Cora. He didn't have any children. Cora didn't have any children either. Cora turned around and offered it to Adelaide, their first cousin Adelaide Mackay McGriff. Adelaide kept it, let's see, that was 3 years later. She kept it for 3 years and sent it off to Adelaide. Adelaide immediately offered it to her first cousins once removed, Aline Bryan and Elizabeth Malone Bryan. And then neither of my great aunts married. When I had only went into a nursing home, she gave this counterpane to my mother. So you can see that counterpanes, family textiles, do not always descend from mother to daughter to granddaughter. When Elizabeth Mackay gave the counterpane to her grandson Walter, she told him that she had planted and spun the cotton and wove it in 1804 when she was 18 years old. When my mother received the textile and its accompanying documents, the descendants kept records. They kept the notes and the letters, and eventually Aunt Bess, who was a legal secretary, typed up this document, and it included the names and dates of the people who have owned the counterpane. So when my mother received this, she knew that the fabric crop historically grown in Nelson County, Kentucky was flax, not cotton. So she marked through the references to cotton and inserted flax and linen. And yeah, she substituted cotton for linen and flax references. The fabric remained in question until last year when Linda Baumgarten confirmed that the warp is linen and the weft is cotton. Everybody's right. Okay. During a research trip to Kentucky last August, I was in Bardstown in Nelson County, and I realized from what I was looking at and what I was finding that Elizabeth and Uriah Mackay lived for some 20 years in Madison, Indiana, right across the river. You see that? Okay, it's right across the river, Ohio River. And a lot of their children were born in Madison. So a quick trip across the Ohio River brought me to the local Heritage Center, very small, but dedicated staff. And the museum was open that day, but the archive was not. So, I just dropped in. I hadn't called ahead. I asked by chance, while I was there, if the museum had any old white bed covers. And they said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, they had a very special one donated by a local woman, but that had been made in Kentucky. Unfortunately, the curator wasn't there to show it to me. So I scheduled a second trip in September to coincide with archive and curator schedules. When the curator, Julie Curtis, showed me the piece they call the Fowler coverlet, I saw that the embroidery techniques included Dresden work. I told the museum staff that their textiles shared some similarities with the counterpane in the Mesda collection attributed to the Nash sisters in Jefferson County, Kentucky. This is Jefferson County, Indiana. Louisville is in Jefferson County, Kentucky. And it's attributed to about 1823, a wedding in 1823. Let's see, do I change now? There's the Mesda one. Okay. Oh, you wanted to see the Mesda one longer. That's the one. It's very highly prized by Mesda, and this elegant, very elegant work. The donor, let's see, let me back up. Julie Curtis and I went together to the archive, which was open that day, to look up the family Fowler paper, to look up the Fowler family papers. I told her, we're looking for a woman who might have been around, she would have been about marriageable age around 1823, just to see if there's any connection. The donor, Miss Fowler, had received the counterpane from her mother's sister, Sarah Jemima Brown, her unmarried, this is her mother's unmarried sister, Sarah Jemima Brown. Surviving letters indicated that these sisters were young women in 1850. I said, too young. Let's find their mother. And there, as we were looking through all these browned papers, there was a scrap of paper on which Brooke Bennett of Lexington, Kentucky, gave written permission for his daughter Judith to marry William Brown, Jemima and the father. The date of this document was 1823. Now, this attribution is not conclusive, but it's highly suggestive that something was going on here. Then on that same, let's see, let's look at this one some more. It's more interesting. On the same research trip to in September, I also arranged to see several white textiles in the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society, and they let me photocopy accession records of the pieces I didn't see. When I looked at these records later at home, and by the way, of the 15 white bed covers they own, 9 of them are attributed to individual women, particular women that are known. 9 out of 15 pieces. When I looked at these records later at home, I discovered a third example of Dresden embroidery, attributed to Elizabeth Patton Toomey of Clark County, Kentucky. That's Winchester, for any of you who know. I have not yet seen this piece, nor photographed it. I've only seen a photocopy of a black and white photograph, this big. But I hope to arrange for Julie Curtis to meet me at the Historical Society in Frankfurt and to bring the Fowler counterpane so that we can look at them side by side. Okay, on a map of Kentucky, a line connecting Clark County, Lexington, and Jefferson County marks the route of the present U.S. Highway 60, which in turn traces the early coach road linking early settlements between the mountains, across the bluegrass, and to the Ohio River. My colleague Kathy Staples, who's written about this piece, suggests that the presence of Dresden work in Kentucky at this early date indicates the influence of a formally trained instructor of needlework. If I had not poked around looking in odd places for old white bed covers, no one would know that Mesda's highly regarded counterpane has close counterparts. By the way, all 3 of these examples feature cotton embroidery on a linen ground because, as my mother knew, the primary fabric crop in Kentucky was flax, not cotton. We know some things about early American white bed covers. There's so much we don't know, but we know a few general things. Women, particularly but not limited to young women, throughout the eastern United States, made them in great numbers and in great variety. Researching these case studies by myself would take many years because I really pore over lots of old yellow papers and microfilm things in libraries. So I'm looking for other researchers, whether experienced or not, to join me in a collaborative research project. Participants would receive individual guidance as needed in defining their subjects, conducting research, and preparing their contributions for publication. Together we could produce a book that would illuminate these elegant textiles as artifacts of the lives of real women. So I invite anyone who thinks they might be interested to join Gail Backham. Wave your hand, Gail. Gail Backham and I will have a table at lunch. Can we use one of the reserve tables for that? We'll put another. Okay, great, thank you. And if you have any idea that you might want to do this, whether you know where to start or not, please join us for lunch, or if the table is full, then see me later today. Thank you.